Welcome back again to Introduction to Ethics. We are finally on to what is going to be our last presentation in the series, and this time we're going to be studying a system that is known as natural law theory. This particular version of natural law theory is going to be the scholastic view of natural law, which traces itself back to the traditions of Thomas Aquinas and the Aristotelians. So again, there's going to be some overlap with some of the things that we said in the video on virtue ethics, where we dealt with Aristotle in particular. To introduce the topic, I'm going to go through some basic ideas of what natural law theory is, and like a lot of the other presentations before, I'm going to then introduce you to the system through kind of an outline where we look at the 6 major questions of moral philosophy, and then we're going to delve in deeper and really examine the system in a particular order. So as you follow along, first of all, this theory is called natural because it is going to be referring to natures, which we've studied also in the past. And it's a theory that, again, grounds their claims in natures, human natures, and the particular ends that are inherent in that human nature, which is one of the reasons that this system is also called teleological. This is the fourth teleological system that we looked at this year. So moving on, the system also believes that there are objective ethical norms that can be discovered by examining what it means to be human. Okay, and the term also refers to the general moral principles against which particular rules, particular laws, particular codes have to be measured. Okay, so there's a part of the system that will actually allow us to look at laws as practiced within society and judge them according to a natural law principle, whereby we could determine if they are technically laws at all. All right, and there's a very specific view about what a law is, and we'll look at that as well. Now, as I said, since it traces itself back to Thomas Aquinas, who happened to be an Aristotelian. We haven't really introduced him yet in depth, and I'm not going to introduce him in depth. There is going to be some overlap with the Aristotelian virtue ethical system. So we could think of this in a way as a development out of the virtue ethical system. So it actually embraces virtue ethics as a portion of the system. And we could also think of it as an addendum to divine command theory. Thomas Aquinas, being a Christian philosopher, did believe that the commands of God are obligations, as we talked about before when we did divine command theory, but it's going to be a system that goes a little bit beyond a divine command theory. Actually, like I said, having a system of objective laws that we can know quite independent of any kind of special revelation, as we'll mention at the bottom of this particular slide. All right, so it's going to refer to an ethics that's going to be transcendent rather than immanent, at least in the way that I'm talking about, like human convention, right? We've got laws in ethics that we can think of as developments out of human cultures that might be, very subjective in a certain way. That's kind of what I mean by immanent here, is that it's kind of particular, as opposed to a system that transcends or cuts across all human beings and all cultures. Okay. Now, again, these objective morals are grounded in natures, apart from the divine commands that are given in special revelation. We'll talk about 2 terms, general versus special revelation. All right, so these moral precepts are held to exist prior to God's commands, and objective moral values are going to exist outside, like I said, commands that we find in a work like Scripture, which is exactly what we mean when I talk about something like a special revelation. So the commands of Scripture, for, again, at least a Christian, would be considered special revelation. And those operate in conjunction with moral values that are expressed in reality as a whole, which we'll call the general revelation. The idea is that there is a revelation of God and his nature in the things that he has created. So, and we can elaborate on that a little bit more. This is not, again, a theology lesson, but you do have to understand that little bit of a distinction, okay? Now, moral concepts are logically independent of Scripture, and that's actually consistent with the position found in Scripture. So again, a divine command theorist, at least a Christian divine command theorist, who acknowledges the New Testament, for instance, as a source of divine revelation, should acknowledge that there is something of a revelation actually outside of Scripture itself. So Romans 2:14 and 15 basically gives us the biblical passage which talks about the fact that there is something in the created system that reflects God's nature. It says, indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law unto themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are in on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. So the idea that there is a moral law on the hearts of even people that are not believers, or people that do not even look at Scripture is again, the idea that's here. That where do they get that knowledge from? And that would be what we call the general revelation. So natural law could be considered a general revelation in the area of moral values. Okay? And when we say a general revelation, a way that God reveals himself, but in a particular way that refers to the moral expectations of human creatures. The concept of a natural law is also useful, I think, for buttressing or supporting a divine command theory that tries to avoid the possibility of God as an arbitrary lawgiver. We saw that was one of the problems that some object to divine command theory regarding. If you go back to the Euthyphro dilemma, which we studied, you have this idea that if God's commands make something good, and since he can command anything he wills to be good, all right, ethical voluntarism, then you end up with this idea of an arbitrary goodness. But natural law is going to have a way to avoid any kind of arbitrariness because it's going to embed goods in objective things like natures. Now, the critical issue for people that are interested in religious ethics, the questions that might arise, are to what degree are moral values do they exist actually apart from divine commands? Right, the divine command theorist would be interested in that particular question. What's the relationship between reason and revelation in ethics? Right, how much can we know just using human reason apart from any kind of communication from a divine being, for instance? To what degree can people live morally apart from grace? That's again a theological issue. And how is natural law distinct from a non-religious ethical system? If you can understand these ethical principles quite apart from a religious context, then how is it not merely a version of some kind of non-religious system, okay, or a non-religious system in its own right? So I'm not going to answer all these questions, of course, but those would be the concerns of people that are interested in religious ethics. Of course, you got people that are interested in legal theory. They're going to look at this from a perspective of law. What makes a law just, right? There are different theories on that. What are the basis of human rights that are on what basis are those human rights to be protected? If there are such things as human rights, that's another question that we could have thrown in here as well. Now, the two schools of thought basically are, you've got the positivist school. Legal positivism is basically the idea that man posits the laws. Man comes up with the laws. Human cultures bring those about. And there's no essential relationship between law and morality in this view. The laws are simply human creations, or creations of human institutions. And it appears that if morality and laws are related, some groups might try to impose their morality through law. Okay, and that would be a concern. I hear a lot of people talk about, is it right to legislate morality? The fact of the matter is, anytime you legislate, you are legislating some type of morality because you're declaring certain things good and bad in virtue of what's permissible and impermissible, legally speaking. And it's somebody's view of what those things ought to be. The other school would be the school of moral realism, which is committed to the idea that laws do not, in fact, those laws which do not correspond to objective moral values are actually non-laws. Okay, and that's really the perspective of the natural law theorists. These laws may be passed by human institutions, but if they don't correspond to these objective moral standards, right, these principles that we see in a natural law theory, then those laws are not binding. Those laws are not legitimate laws. Those laws are invalid, and again require no obligation. Okay, so again, all human law has to line up with, or at least can't conflict with, the principles inherent in natural law, because we want to have objective moral values grounding the system, or at least embedded in the system. Now, like I said, the main thinker for natural law theory that we're going to focus on, the only thinker that we're going to focus on in this particular presentation, is Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274. His background, he was born in Aquino, Italy. That's where his last name, we consider his last name, is actually Thomas of Aquino, where he was born. He studied at the University of Naples. He becomes a Dominican friar. So he's, again, a monk, but from a order that was very much dedicated to education and teaching. He received a doctorate at the University of Paris, where he was a student of Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great. And his major writings I also included on the screen, the Summa Theologica being the most famous of them. And there's a portion of the Summa which is known as the Treatise on Law. And that's where he has most of his information or his views on what we call natural law theory. Okay, Summa Contra Gentiles, another major work, his only purely philosophical work on being in essence. So those are some among others that he has produced. He was quite prolific as a thinker. Now, as a natural law theorist, he's not just as a natural law theorist, he was an Aristotelian in his philosophy. So, which means he's going to be in agreement with Aristotle in many cases. Aquinas was one of the strongest proponents of Aristotelian philosophy. When he refers to the philosopher in his writings, that's who he's talking about. It's Aristotle. Aristotle previously had been, in a way, lost to the Christian West. There weren't very many of his writings that had been preserved in the early Middle Ages, and those that did have some familiarity with him viewed him as heretical because of some of his views, such as the idea that there's no immortality of the soul, which was quite contrary to the teachings of Christianity. But Aquinas didn't really see any contradiction between faith and reason, and actually was able to understand Aristotle in a way compatible with Christianity. His moral philosophy also merges with Aristotle's virtue ethics, and actually, I said that wrong. His philosophy, his moral philosophy, kind of merges ideas from Aristotle's virtue ethics with things that we find in Augustinian theology. Augustine, who's a thinker that I believe we mentioned way back when we dealt with the issue of free will versus determinism, but only briefly, was probably one of the greatest and most important early Christian philosophers that kind of set the stages for Christian philosophy throughout the Middle Ages and even into the modern era. And Aquinas, again, is indebted to him for a lot of his thinking. Now, Aristotle held that morality is grounded in human nature, which we talked about before. Thus, it's immanent in the way that it's built into us, right? It's inherent within the human being. And Augustine held that morality is grounded in something that has to transcend human nature. So what we're going to get in natural law theory is something that is both. There's also, again, a strong relationship between ethics and politics, as we also found in Aristotle, again, and Plato before him. And the view is that well-being and well-doing, as related to law and the common good, those two things go together. You can't really separate, the well-being of the individual from certain actions that lead to that well-being. Ethics provided the grounding for fundamental political concepts, right? And then there are two things of concern, both rules and virtues. Now, the purpose of rules in Aquinas' view is to mold essentially good men. This lines up very much with the virtue system that we talked about before, the whole process of habituation to perfect the faculties, right? To develop things like courage and prudence and generosity and justice and those types of characteristics, right? So that to mold you into virtuous individuals, and the rules are there to guide you as well as other people in your life. Now, Augustine actually believed that the law was there to constrain essentially sinful men. It's not that Aquinas doesn't believe man is sinful, but he does believe in this idea of perfection of the faculties through the virtue building process. So the virtue ethicist, the means of attaining virtue, like I said, is this habituation process. But as a Christian philosopher, you also have this idea of God's grace being instrumental as well. So there are two means of attaining virtue. And that again contrasts with Augustine, who not only saw laws as there to restrain sinful men, but he also saw grace as the only way to develop virtues, and not through habituation. So he's going to differ a little bit. Now, Aquinas' view on morality is that morality is a habitual choice, which means this is going to be a choice that is routinely made. Actually, the habitual choice of certain actions. This is a routine choosing of actions, which furthers a hierarchical, ordered, natural ends that are inherent in human nature. And I know that's a mouthful. We could talk a little bit. This note that I have on the screen elaborates a little bit about what I mean. But again, this is not that you once in a while make the proper choice, right, regarding our natural ends. But we habitually do it. This is a way that you can consistently and with some degree of accuracy choose the ends according to a certain hierarchy that they exist within our human nature, because there are ends that are higher and ends that are lower. Okay, and the lower ends exist for the sake of the higher. And in the note, we'll talk here, the faculties, which refer back again to Aristotle. We're going to keep having to talk about Aristotle, even if you thought we were done with him. Vegetative, sensitive, and rational faculties, which correspond to the three souls that we talked about before, have their own ordered ends ranging hierarchically. Some ends are subordinate to others. Nutritive powers, right? Those would be the ones that you find in the vegetative soul, aim at the end of sustaining life, which in turn makes it possible for an organism to carry out other higher ends, right? If you're not alive, you can't do very much walking, thinking, etc. The highest faculties of the rational soul are the intellect and the will. The will is going to be something new for us, and each aims at its own end, truth and goodness respectively. We'll talk about that. The intellect's capacity to know the truth is more fully realized the deeper its understanding of the natural world and its causes. This ultimately terminates in knowledge of the highest and first cause, which is God. And that's where we're going to talk about ultimate ends of the human nature. So the highest end, according to Aristotle, is happiness. But for Aquinas, truth and goodness are found ultimately united in the person of God. And in God, we find our greatest end, which we would still call happiness, but we also use the word beatitude. All right, it's this blessed state of union, in a sense, with God. Again, when we use the word eudaimonia in Aristotle, there are different ways to understand it. You've got Epicurus' idea, right? This complete absence of pain, this tranquility. You've got Aristotle's view of eudaimonia, which was something a little bit more robust, which included the virtuous life, right? And then you've got Aquinas' view of eudaimonia, I guess we could say, or happiness, which is going to be this thing that has to do with God, ultimately speaking. Okay. Now, before I get to the actual 6 questions where we're going to lay out the system in an outline format, I'm just going to add a few other things about natural law. Again, the good, what we call good, is going to be based on natural tendencies, right? The essential natures of things have faculties, have tendencies, have directedness. That's what we would call a thing's telos, or its end. That also is a thing's function in a certain ways, right? The faculties that we have are there to allow us to do certain things, right? My faculty of sight is there to allow me to see. There's a functionality. The good propels a man towards his telos, which is happiness, knowing, loving God, where evil is something that's going to interfere with that, right? So we could talk about good and evil in relation to that end, where good promotes what's natural and evil interferes with what's natural. And the values that we're going to talk about, again, are objective, and there's a transcendent source in what we would call the eternal law. And we'll look at the types of law right now. Not in detail, we'll talk about this more later, but Aquinas talks about 4 different types of law. The eternal law being really the source of all other law, if you want to think of it that way, because it refers to God's thoughts. Then you've got the natural law, which are going to be the principles of morality. This is the natural law that we is tied in again to human nature. and is based on the eternal law. And then the human law, number 3, which is basically the positive man-made law, and then divine law, which would refer, again, to special revelation of things of concern for, various salvific purposes and stuff like that. Okay, so the 4 types of law: eternal, natural, human, and divine. And we will spend most of our time only looking at the first 3, though we'll talk a little bit about each of the 4 as we progress. Now, do you remember the 6 questions? First one's the moral psychology question. Here we're going to look again briefly at Aristotle's practical syllogism, because again, Aquinas wouldn't dismiss that in any way, but there's a new factor that's added into the mix at this point, and that's going to be this issue of will, where Aristotle believes that your desires and your deliberation come together to make your choice. Aquinas believes that there is a will involved in our choosing. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the will is, what type of power it is, the fact that it's actually a rational appetite, which sounds very strange from what we said about Aristotle, since he had the appetites categorized with his desires and reason separated off from that. We're going to see how Aquinas kind of brings those 2 together, and we'll talk about that. The content question would have to do with the principles of the natural law, and we'll look at, again, the first principle, which is that good is to be done and pursued where evil is to be avoided. And that sounds so basic. You almost think, well, why is that even a principle, and how does that operate as a principle within a system? But it does. How we know these principles, and that's only one of the primary principle. There are principles derived from that, but how we know the principles of morality is through a power that's known as synderesis, which is a interesting word, probably something you've never heard before, and it's also interesting in how it's defined as a natural habit. So we'll have to talk a little bit about what that means. We'll get to that down the road just a little bit. The justification question, how or why rather should we be a good person? Ultimately, we can deal with this very briefly and real quickly here, in that being a good person or a noble person is that it's going to further our natural ends. And of course, our natural ends are there for a reason, and it's ultimately to our benefit. The ultimate end constitutes man's ultimate good and ultimate happiness. Okay, so that's one of the reasons we ought to be good, is because good is pursuing that ultimate goal, and everybody wants to be happy. As we said before, nobody ever questions that particular end. But to understand this, it really is a function of character. Okay, like we said before, the virtuous man can understand virtue, whereas other people not fully. So your moral appreciation, again, has to do with that character. So it's not always easy to answer the question, maybe of a child who comes up and says, why should I be good? It's hard to explain to them, this idea of the ultimate good and it's good for them and happiness, etc. Even if they understand the words, they might not fully understand why that is, again, until they have a development of their character. The fourth question is the motivation question. Again, tied into this idea of ultimate happiness. You're not going to be happy if you work contrary to the ends of your nature. Ontological source question is going to be twofold. We're going to need to not only talk about human nature, but also God, which is the source of the human nature in the first place. So we'll talk a little bit about both of those and how that works in a sense. And then the last question is the moral education question, how we know the principles or how we're trained, because not only do we know these things through this synderesis, which we mentioned a second ago, but there's also moral education that's necessary, since human beings are very good at ignoring things they know to be true, self-deception, choosing contrary to the principles that they inherently know, and so on. So education is needed. Okay, with all that out of the way, and I know I'm talking rather quickly, we're going to turn now to natural law theory in detail. And I'm going to start by going through some basic terminology. Some of these terms you may have heard before, some of them you haven't. Creature, kind of general term. That's going to be used of any created thing. Okay, so I don't want you to think like some kind of monster movie, but a creature could be you as well. right? You are a created thing. And we're not saying, again, the system, right, of Aquinas is a Christian system. He did believe in a special creation, the Genesis account and so on. The theory of creation is really untouched by Big Bang cosmology and evolutionary biology. Okay, species evolution would be in accord with the physical principles of the universe, but the physical principles themselves need to be accounted for. And Aquinas, of course, would account for those based on some kind of grounding in the archetypes of God's, I was going to say collective unconscious, but that's Jung. The archetypes or exemplar causes that are in God. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. Substance, we already said, is an actual thing, right? This is something that has its own essence or nature and an active existence imparted to it. A nature, again, being the essence of a thing or the form of a thing in respect to how that thing behaves or acts. Okay, so a lot of that, really nothing new, really nothing that you shouldn't be able to grasp pretty quickly. So substance and nature, I think, are the two most important there. Then you've got this thing called a type, which goes back to what I was saying a second ago, this idea of an exemplar cause. When we talk about an exemplar cause or a divine idea, what we're thinking of is some kind of pre-existing model, right? It's a expression of the divine essence as imitable. Is one way to put it. It's hard to unpack that, of course, very quickly, but we could think of it as an extrinsic formal cause, right? If I talk about a formal cause of me, it would be my form, right? This is what it means to be human, the essence of humanity. And of course, that form is intrinsic within me, okay? When I talk about an extrinsic formal cause, we're talking about that form as it exists apart from the substance, okay? So the form of humanness exists apart from me in the mind of God, okay? And this would be linked again to this idea of the eternal law, which is a type of divine wisdom that directs everything in the universe, right? So everything in the ordered universe is based on these exemplar causes that are already there prior in God himself. So God has this idea, right, that we'd call an idea of humanity, an idea of this, an idea of that. And those then become instantiated in the creation process where you actually have these things made. A little bit complicated, but I don't know if that's the best way to describe it. I may be ruining the concept a little bit or misrepresenting it slightly. I apologize if I'm doing that. Natural law, again, what we're studying is the participation of the rational creature, human beings in our case, in this eternal law, right? So, okay, that's probably good enough for that. Powers, we could refer to powers again very much the same way we talked about potentials and faculties within creatures. They're permanent abilities of the soul, intrinsic principles of operation. So the faculty of speech, those types of things. We'll talk about those as powers. And then you've got another intrinsic principle of operation that we will call the habits. And these are just dispositions, which really isn't very different from what we talked about when we talked about Aristotle's virtue ethics. But the tendency was to think of habits as something that are purely developed over time and through practice, right? This practice of, or this process of habituation. And they can exist that way, right? But they don't have to exist that way. There are some habits that we could say are natural habits. All right, it's just a tendency to do things in a certain way, and naturally we do certain things in certain ways, certain physical actions, mental actions, and stuff like that. So again, we don't want to confuse the word habit with just this idea of a repetitive and compulsive way of behaving. Okay, so this will tie in with synderesis, which we'll hit in a little bit. Appetites are powers by which we apprehend and seek the good, right? What you have appetites for are the things that are already understood to be good. And we can subdivide these into the sensitive and rational appetites. The sensitive appetites are going to, again, apprehend the good via the senses. Very similar to what we were talking about when we talked about the desires, having the emotions and appetites in Aristotle. The subdivisions of the sensitive appetite are going to be your irascible appetite, your feelings, and then your concupiscible appetites, which are your desires. Now, what we're interested in here is not so much the sensitive appetite as this other one, this rational appetite, which is what I said before seems different from Aristotle, because we talked about the desires on one hand and the reason on the other hand, right? Our desires and our deliberation, which have to unite to produce a choice. Here you're taking the rational and the appetite and bringing them together in what we'll call, or what Aquinas will call, the will. And this is the ability to apprehend the good intellectually via the mind. Okay, and we'll unpack that again a little bit more. We're still going through terminology, so we'll get to that in a little bit more depth very soon. Now, synderesis, which you've already heard me mention, this particular slide lays it out a little bit more clearly, hopefully, in what I'm talking about. So when we talked about habits, some of them being natural, this is the key one that I had in mind. So it's a natural habit of the mind by which one who has reached the age of reason, which varies from person to person, grasps the first principles or fundamental precepts of the natural law without having to be taught them. Okay? So there's this inherent ability or power that we have to grasp these first principles. And the idea is that this power is infallible in that it will always accurately grasp those first principles. And Aquinas believes it's a necessary precondition for morality, because if you don't know the first principles, then of course, how can you make choices that we would consider moral choices? Habitual knowledge of the universal practical principles of moral action is what synderesis would be. Principles of natural law are always in human reason habitually, but are not always considered by reason actually, right? So they are in there, and even when you grasp the first principles, you're not always consciously thinking about those first principles, right? They're always in the mind unconsciously, but not always consciously. You know them, but you're not always thinking about them. And that makes sense, okay? Because we think of most things that we know in that way, that they don't have to be consciously present for you to consider them knowledge. Not that we're doing epistemology, and I don't want to go into the whole complexity of what that is. But the next thing we have that's related in a way to synderesis, or actually follows from it, is this idea of conscience. And that's a word I know you have heard before, right? That we have a conscience. And this is when we apply our synderesis to situations, we get the conscience. So we have the principles, the knowledge of principles that we apply to particular issues. So conscience literally means with knowledge. It's the act of, again, applying law to cases. So in a way, it's your applied ethics involves the conscience. Got to say it right, or it don't make any sense. Virtues and vices we've already talked about. So virtues, just as a very quick recap, are going to be divided into two basic types, depending if it's a perfection of the reason or perfection of the desires. We've got our intellectual virtues, and we have our moral virtues, just as in Aristotle. Vices, of course, being bad. Okay, phones, let's skip. Speculative reason just has to do with our reason being directed at pure knowledge, necessary truths, things like that. And the virtue in regards to speculative knowledge is speculative wisdom. And then you get the practical reason, which is our capacity to reason about contingent truths and make choices in that way, usually about actions and such. And the virtue in respect to our practical reason is what we'll call our prudence. Okay, also practical wisdom, as Aristotle would call it. And then the perfect community, we'll skip that as well. So got through the terminology a little bit slowly, but again, hopefully you will now understand words that we use as we progress through the rest of the presentation. So take a breath and let's take a look at intellect and will. Now, Aquinas agrees with Aristotle that thought by itself moves nothing. That is a complete rejection of, you guessed it, Immanuel Kant, and this idea of pure practical reason. Okay? That pure reason could be practical would be foreign to Aquinas and Aristotle. Now, according to Aristotle, remember, the actions originate with this union of desire and intellect. They're together necessary for an action, or a choice, and they're sufficient, however, when they come together in union. You can't act without the desire, and the intellect gives rise to the choice, and what's going to follow, again, is going to be the necessitated choice, the union of desire and deliberation, or deliberate desire, as it's often called. He doesn't talk at all about will. All right, the concept of a will you won't find in Aristotle, at least explicitly. If you go over to the practical syllogism, again, I just kind of laid it out here. Desire and deliberation, which conclude in your choice. We talk about how that's done, and it also brought up the idea that Aristotle was a determinist, and that our choices follow necessarily from the deliberation and the desires that go into, as your premises, into that syllogism. Okay, so your actions simply follow. There's a necessary choice based on those premises. Now, of course, we have some developments in Aquinas. And by the way, remember, I didn't say that just because he was a determinist, there isn't a sense of freedom built in, because Aristotle is a compatibilist, and that we're free, at least insofar, not that he elaborated on this either, but you could understand that there is a room for freedom, at least, when we think of ourselves as knowing originators of our action, that we're responsible, again, for the deliberation, not something forced upon us from the outside. That's what the compatibilists would say. Now, the developments that we're going to see in Aquinas' thoughts are going to be reason being separated in a certain way into two powers, or at least comprised of two separate powers. One's cognitive and one's appetitive. The cognitive power we'll call the intellect. So when we talk about intellect and will, under the heading of reason, we find both of them. The intellect is that which enables us to know and understand. It's the rational aspect as far as we think of reason. It's a discursive movement that it participates in, where we're moving from premises to conclusions, right? And it's a power to grasp abstract universal forms, which is important. You think of the idea of, no, I'm not going to elaborate on that just for the sake of time. So the object is going to be universal truth. That's what the intellect is after. And intellect enables us to apprehend goodness as well. So it's going to help pick out what it recognizes as good. The appetitive power is going to be the will. We could call this an intellectual appetite, and the intellectual appetite also has to be rational. It's a principle for action, and it's a power distinct from the intellect, the power by which we desire, again, the universal. The native desire is for an understood good. Now, an appetite that is responsive to the intellect's estimation of what the good is, we could say, is what the will is. So the intellect will pick out or identify what's good in truth, and the will then pursue it, okay, as its natural object, if that makes sense. All acts of the will are dependent on antecedent acts of the intellect, right? The intellect has to supply the will with an object to which it goes after, or to which it inclines. The object moves the will not as an efficient cause. It doesn't push it, but it moves it as a final cause, because the will, again, has an end in mind, which is goodness. Its distinct object ultimately being universal goodness. All right, always the highest goodness is what the will is aiming at. But it is an appetite. So when we talk about an appetite, we're just talking about a power of the soul by which we're inclined towards something. Okay, and it inclines, like I said, towards the good. Knowledge is also important here, because knowledge being in a very bizarre way, I'm going to define it this way. Again, not an epistemology class, but the scholastic tradition holds that knowledge is the attainment of a new form in a non-material way. So if I was to unpack that for you briefly, let's say to attain a form in a material way is actually to become that thing, right? If I had the form of a tree, materially, I would be a tree. But as a rational being with an intellect and reason, I had the ability to hold the form of a tree, not materially, but cognitively, where I have that form again in me. I'm intentionally being the tree, I guess you could say, without actually being a tree. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense. But again, I have the abstraction. I have the ability to pull that essence, that form, from the particular object and hold it in my mind in a universal way. And that's one way we got to understand knowledge, right? It's a metaphysical activity. So the appetites are consequent upon knowledge, and the inclination of appetite follows upon the knowledge, because before you can desire anything, first there has to be knowledge about that thing. You have to know about it before you pursue it. Now, there's two types of knowledge. You have sense knowledge and intellectual knowledge. The sense knowledge is really just this idea of apprehending forms in their particularity, right? This is what my eyes pick out. It's what my ears pick out. It's what my hands can touch. The intellectual knowledge is the apprehension of those universal forms that I talked about a second ago, when I abstract from the particular the concept that I'm going to have or form that I'm going to hold in my mind. Now, if there's two types of knowledge, of course, there's two types of appetites. You've got the sensual appetites, which follow our sense knowledge, and you've got the intellectual appetites, which follow from our intellectual knowledge, and that is what we call the will, the intellectual appetite. The object of both appetites is proportionate to the kind of knowledge appropriate to the appetite, and all appetites tend towards goodness in some manner, and the manner of tending is determined by the kind of knowledge that we have. Right? So sensitive appetites tend towards particular goods, and the will, the rational intellectual appetite, is going to tend towards the universal good. Okay? So that's the ultimate thing that it pursues. Now, is the will free? The view, in short, is yes, it is. It is not coerced. That the idea would be completely repugnant to the will. The knowledge does move the will, right, by supplying its idea of what is good, and that moves it, like we said, as a final end. And it might appear then that the intellect is going to necessitate the will's movement, right? Because if the intellect picks something out as good, and the will just naturally pursues the good, it seems like the will is determined then to do certain things, and therefore would not be free. But the fact is, Aquinas would see the will as free, and why that is because of this. Number one, no single account of the good is going to necessitate the will's movement, because most goods don't have a necessary connection to happiness. Right? Most things we don't need in order to be happy in the ultimate sense. The will does not incline to them, therefore, of necessity. Right? We could always, as I say on the next slide, reconsider as we weigh these options. Some goods don't have a necessary connection to happiness. The will does not incline necessarily to those goods either. I'm sorry, some goods do have a necessary connection to happiness. And then again, if they do have a necessary connection, it would seem like we necessarily then pursue them through the will. But Aquinas would say, no, you don't necessarily pursue those either. There's no necessary inclination towards even the necessary goods, because our ultimate end, our ultimate final happiness, is always opaque to us at this level. We don't know exactly what that is. And if the will is directed towards this ultimate end, we don't always know what particular ends lead in that general direction, because of this opaqueness, of this difficulty in seeing exactly what that ultimate end is constituted by. There's a freedom of the will, again, to kind of navigate and choose between goods. So the will has no necessity in the order of, like I said, efficient causality, only a final cause that's moving it. So the will has necessity in that sense. It is the faculty by which we're inclined towards things, and to be inclined implies an object of inclination or an end. And the end of the will, universal goodness, is given by its nature, and we can always reconsider the proximate goods as we try to navigate towards this ultimate good out there, which happens to be God for Aquinas. Okay. That's what the will is. It's quite a different account from what we find in Kant. Right? Kant's idea of the will, remember, is a thing that is so autonomous and free that nothing moves it. Right? It's the power actually to choose between our duties and our desires. Nothing like that in Aquinas. The will actually is inclined. Okay, so keep that in mind. But it's inclined towards the good. All right, architecture of the law. Let's talk a little bit about the law and the types of law. So law is really defined in this way. It's an ordinance of reason for the common good that's made by him who has care of the community. And then it's promulgated, or at least made known. So the necessary elements, I just broke those down for you. Again, reason. It's an ordinance of reason. There's got to be a reason behind it. Very much like Kant, right? Law implies reason. So here we're referring to our practical reason. It's made known, of course. It's useless if there's laws that are not known. How do you follow those laws? And it's for the common good. And the idea of a nature, right, in natural law is the thing that's ultimately going to ground any sense of a common good, because there's a common nature which makes the same things good for all of us objectively and universally. And then again, this is going to be issued, or laws instituted by somebody that's in charge of caring for the community. Now, in the grand design of things, we've got the different types of law. So again, the eternal law, which I talked about before, can be described as the principles by which God made and governs the universe. This is the pattern of the divine art, and it refers to God's thoughts. Right? We talked about these as archetypes. You could also talk about them as divine ideas, or we could use the word I just lost the word. Exemplar causes. There, I found it again. Okay, so it's the plan in the mind of God regarding how things could, should, and of course do work in the world. And without the eternal law, nothing would be knowable. This is what ultimately gives coherence to the universe and intelligibility to the universe. All right, the universe is not just a chaos. There's an order to it, and rational beings can discern this order. Okay, so all law derives its authority from the eternal law. So eternal law is your foundation. This is ultimately the ground, if you can think of it that way, of the entire system. The natural law comes next. And this is actually how we could talk about, natural law being grounded in God, but also in human nature, because the natural law here is going to follow from the eternal law. So the natural law can be described as a reflection of the eternal law in every structure of the creator rational mind, directing men towards their natural end. And it's a manifestation, like I said, of the eternal law. It's teleological, it's based on natural tendencies, and it's imprinted. It determines our inclinations for proper acts, proper ends, and it does not deny free will. As I said, even though the will is inclined, it does not deny that it's free, because obviously we're able to deviate from the natural law. People do it all the time, violate what they know to be right and true. Okay, but it is accessible to all men. That's really the important thing with natural law theory, is all men can know these principles via reason. Now, it refers to not only the general principles, but also specific moral prescriptions which follow from those general principles. General principles would be things like justice, fairness, respect. And then the specific moral prescriptions are going to have to do with, well, how do you, what are the things you do to attain justice and fairness and so on. So the principles of natural law, again, via synderesis, we'd say they're self-evident. And there are also other principles that are derived precepts from the reasoning that follows from the general principles. So we could divide the principles into a couple. We've got primary and secondary principles within the system. The primary or first principles we consider as axioms. These are things that are just givens. They don't need to be proven. They cannot be proven, but they're what every other moral proof or argument depends on. And the idea of the synderesis is that we can't not know these things, right? The synderesis is infallible, and an example of one of those primary axiomatic principles would be something like good should be pursued and evil avoided. It's incredibly general, right? And it would have to be as a first principle. It should be as general as it possibly could be. Then we have the secondary principles, which are derived from the first principles. We can call these theorems. They're more detailed expressions of moral truth. And we've got under this category, you have the immediate precepts, those which are obvious as soon as we look at them, things like do not murder. And then you've got common precepts, which are less obvious and sometimes more detailed. And an example of this would be always return to a person things that belong to him. Okay? So those are examples. Now, we could break these into general versus common. Looking back here, the primary first principle axiomatic ones and the secondary immediate precepts we'll put under the category of general. And then the common are going to be the other one. So the general principles are going to apply in all cases. That's why they're general, right? They cut across universally, all men. Those are your primary and your secondary immediate ones, as we saw here, okay? The common principles apply to most cases, but here you can have some exceptions. So going back to this common precept number 2 down at the bottom, always return to a person what belongs to him. There might be exceptions to that one, such as you're not obligated to return property borrowed in a case where perhaps a friend is drunk and his property is the car keys that you happen to be holding for him, right? So there are those types of common but with exception principles. All right, third, we have the human law, which is the detailed determinations or applications of the natural law, and they should be applications of the natural law if they're going to actually truly be lawful to circumstances of particular human society. So this would be what we call a positive law, conventional, man-made. And it's devised by human reason. It's contingent, so it's not necessary, it's not unchanging. Sometimes it needs to change to more approximately represent the natural law. And it's going to include both civil and criminal law. And it gives particular determination to general requirements of the natural law as it applies in cultural and historical circumstances. Okay, and that can vary obviously from culture to culture as long as it doesn't deviate from the natural law. So there is going to be a universal right and wrong that is absolute and universal, even if positive laws change from culture to culture based on those unique situations. Now, how are the human laws actually derived? Well, they're derived in 2 ways: by deduction, where we conclude things from premises. So an example here would be the natural law says not to harm one another or not to harm another person. And we can reason that poison is something that does harm, and therefore we can conclude that you shouldn't poison, right? So it's a basic deduction from premises to conclusions. Or it could be derived via specification, where we are going to determine certain generalities. Here's an example where natural law seeks the safety of people, right? That's part of your general principle. And positive law is going to add details that allows this, or that actually enables us to more effectively protect people, such as passing driving laws, where in the United States it becomes a law to drive on the right-hand side of the road. Not that it is necessary to drive on the right-hand side of the road and driving on the left would be immoral, but by specifying the law in such a way, it is there for the purpose of protecting people. And in our society, because of that accepted rule, driving on the left does become immoral, right? Because it is, again, now a danger to people's lives. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. And the role of the human law is, again, to enforce the natural law, since we can deviate from it, and make certain acts punishable. And human law is necessary because society needs things like that to operate in a situation where everybody is going to be safe and the common good is looked after. So that would make sense. And then finally we have the divine law. And like I said, I'm not going to talk much about the divine law, other than that this is the law that we find in the revealed scriptures. Okay, so for Aquinas, that would be the Bible. It's a reflection of the eternal law in God's revealed scriptures, and it directs man towards God. This is the specifically religious institutions. It's only knowable through special revelation. And it goes beyond natural law, obviously. Natural law aims at your natural good, and divine law ultimately aims at your ultimate good. And it's necessary because some divine law is not evident in nature. Like the human law, it's sometimes suited to contingent historical circumstances. So I don't want to say it's completely separate, but unlike human law, it's perfect. Right? Human laws can make mistakes. Societies do that all the time. Divine law doesn't. It's the idea, and it's absolutely binding. Whereas human laws, if they don't match the principles of moral law, or reflect the principles of moral law, or at least if they violate the principles of moral law, then those human laws are judged as unlawful, whereas the divine law is absolutely binding. It would never contradict the natural law, period. Divine law, however, is not intended to be enforced. And this is something I think the non-religious ethicist would agree with, right? So the government's charged with directing the community as to its natural good and only its natural good, whereas human laws should then enforce only natural law. Human law should not, however, violate the divine law. And the idea here is that the divine law and the natural law are from the same source, and they're not going to be in contradiction to one another. So, of course, what's contrary to the divine law would be unlawful, just as what's contrary to the natural law would be unlawful. Now, finally, let's get into this idea of the grounding of the law in nature. Now, analysis and justification of fundamental moral claims cannot be made without reference to metaphysics. And you've probably already noticed that, because half of what I've said so far has been about metaphysics, claims about natures and ends and those types of things. Ultimately, there is no ethics without some kind of ontology to ground it. There's no morality without metaphysics. And even when we talked about Epicurus, for instance, we saw how his metaphysical views or his cosmological views were connected to his ethics. It's even more so the case, I think, with Aristotle and with Aquinas. Now, the natural law, remember, is called natural because it derives from human nature, right? Not just nature in general. If something's natural, therefore it's good. Right? You see this in advertising. This particular cigarette brand has, all natural ingredients, makes it sound much healthier for you. Of course, that's not what we're talking about, it being natural, therefore it's good. No, what's good is determined particularly by your nature, okay? Not nature in the more general sense. And again, this is conceived, what a nature is conceived of in Aristotelian essentialist terms. And we can think of Aristotelian essentialism as really an abstract metaphysics and an ontology of morals. Okay? So, first, natural law is self-evident. The first principle of natural law, which we've already stated, I will state again. The good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. And Aquinas goes on to say, all other precepts of the natural law are based on this. Now, this first principle seems difficult to justify because you could easily ask, well, why should I be good? Right? As it says, good is to be done and pursued. Why? However, to ask that question really misunderstands what Aquinas is trying to say. So understanding Aquinas properly, the first principle actually is obvious. He's not saying that it's just self-evident that we ought to be morally good. What he is saying is that it's self-evident that whenever we act, we are pursuing something that we see as good in some way and avoid something that we see as bad. And I think I've said that many times in the course of this semester as well. Even when we do something that we believe is morally bad, the reason we choose to do it is because there's some good we're still picking out in that action, some end that we perceive as a pleasure, which is a type of good, or another type of good. Now, why is this correct? Well, metaphysically, our practical reason has a natural end towards which it's ordered. Okay? This end is the pursuit of what the intellect perceives as good. The intellect pursues truth. The will pursues the good. We already set that up, right? So the intellect identifies what's good. The will, which pursues the good, then moves us to obtain that good. And what is in fact good is the realization of the various ends that are inherent in our human nature. Human beings have capacities and ends, the fulfillment of which is good and the frustration of which is bad, and that's just an objectively true thing. Breathing, digesting, seeing, those types of things are objectively good and inherent in our nature. The rational intellect understands this and knows that the good, it's good to realize the ends and it's bad to frustrate them. So a good action is always going to be in accord with reason. It's irrational to do bad. Okay, so why do we do good? Because that's just what it means to be rational, right? It is what we ought to be doing. Which brings us to this concept of obligation. We've looked at this idea of an ought, right, as an obligation, something we should do, something we must do. We talk about where that comes from, right? The laws that we posit in Kant as categorical imperative supplies an obligation to us in his system. The divine command theory, saying the command of God is the obligation. Well, Aquinas looks at obligation as something different. An ought is viewed in a particular context. So natural law recognizes an ought to be meaningful only within a teleological concept, or context rather. So the ought is not just derived from a divine command. It's not just derived from pure practical reason. The ought is a precondition for the fulfillment of a faculty's end. It's something that you should do in order for the end to actually, for the faculty to achieve its ultimate goal. All right? And since it's tied in, again, with our natures and with those ends, there is no is-ought distinction. Right? As a matter of fact, the fact of the matter, is intimately tied in with the ought. The grounds of the moral obligation, that which makes it the case that moral precepts are categorical. Okay? Because moral precepts are categorical and not merely hypothetical. So let's see how. We talked about this a lot with Kant, right? The distinction between categorical and hypothetical imperatives. We're going to see how the hypothetical actually becomes categorical in this system. So just follow along. This, I think, is kind of intuitive. Number one, if I want what's good for me, then I ought to pursue what realizes my natural ends and avoid what frustrates them. Now that's true, right? The consequent, of course, only has force if you accept the antecedent. The consequent that I ought to pursue what realizes my natural ends only follows from the antecedent that I want what's good for me. Number two is that I do want what's good for me. And that's, again, true of all of us in virtue of our nature. And that's self-evident. Nobody wants what's bad for them. Everybody wants what's good for them. Okay? Even if not always consciously. So the conclusion 3 is I ought to pursue what realizes my natural ends and avoid what frustrates them. Just modus ponens form of a hypothetical argument. If those premises are correct, 1 and 2, then the conclusion follows that I ought to pursue what realizes my natural ends and avoid what frustrates them. And that has categorical force, even though it's contingent on a hypothetical statement. Because number 2, the second premise, has categorical force that I do want what is good for me. And number 2 has categorical force because it can't be otherwise, given my nature. So the obligatory character is actually determined by the metaphysics of final causality. Moral duty is thus natural. Certain objects are natural means to a man's end. Human desire of that end is also natural. So the necessity of the means also becomes natural as well. Now, I threw in a little bit of a thought experiment since we haven't had one in such a long time. And I'll just raise this interesting scenario just to let you think a little bit about how a natural law theorist might approach this. Again, put out of your mind all human law, contract obligations, etc. This is a surrogate mother contract that's been signed where Frank and Alice want a family, but Alice is unable to conceive a child. So they find this woman, Phoebe, who is willing to be a surrogate mother. And she agrees to carry Frank's child and signs a contract stipulating that she's going to be paid $15,000 in all expenses until the time of the birth, whereby the child is going to be handed over to Frank and Alice. As she nears the date of delivery, however, Phoebe changes her mind and wants to keep the child. Frank and Alice decide to take Phoebe to court over violation of the contract. Now the question is, should the court uphold the contract? I'm not saying that the court, legally speaking, I'm saying natural law, again, is supposed to judge whether human law is a true law. So the question is, according to natural law theory, should the court uphold the contract? Is it binding? Why or why not? And some things you want to consider possibly. Does Phoebe have a right to change her mind? If she does, on what basis? And issues to consider are also things like this idea of autonomy, the idea of informed consent in entering the contract, and the concept of selling human beings, even though you don't want to think of this as the same situation as slavery per se. But again, also consider natural human ends and how those are designed. So, like I said, I'm not going to answer this question. You could stop the video at this point if you want to think about it for a little bit. But it's actually interesting to actually reflect on. So figured I'd throw that in for you guys. All right, let's turn now and talk about the good and this fact-value distinction, which we just said really isn't there. in Aquinas. So natural law theory has been accused of ignoring the fact-value distinction. Again, the fact-value distinction as a review goes back basically to David Hume, who argued that the conclusions about what you ought to do, our value judgments, can't be inferred from mere premises that talk about facts, right? Factual judgments, what is the case. And to assume that you can derive values from facts is to commit a naturalistic fallacy, right? Or to even define the good in terms of natural things is a naturalistic fallacy. So again, I gave you the example at the bottom of what the naturalistic fallacy is. I don't want to go into that again, but if you don't remember, you can go ahead and read that little slide. But again, this was the issue, right? It goes back to Hume, and it's this distinction between facts and values. One can't get to the other. There's this unbridgeable gap between them. And we saw Aristotle was a way to respond to this, because when we talked about the fact-value distinction at the beginning of the semester, we saw that Aristotle did not accept the fact-value distinction, and Aquinas is going to follow him in that. So Thomism denies that there's anything like a fact-value distinction. There is no such thing as a purely factual description of reality. Value is actually built into the structures of the facts from the very outset, from the beginning. The gap between a fact and value could exist only given some kind of mechanistic or nominalistic understanding of nature, which we don't have in the essentialist ontology with the teleological idea of nature. So this particular metaphysical view doesn't have that fault or flaw, I would say, as a mechanistic or nominalistic view of things. So value is also, a term that might not be the best term to use, which is why we're talking about the good here, as you see at the heading. But value seems to presuppose somebody doing the valuing, which makes it sounds at least very subjective. Thus it insinuates, again, this subjectivity. The Aristotelians and the Thomists, however, tend to speak of the good rather than the value. And the good is something that's entirely objective. So, metaphysically, what is the good? And this is going to be confusing. This is a claim in scholasticism that is hard to unpack, but the idea is that the good is convertible with being. I have those in italics because what I'm saying is that the good and being are the same thing, though they are distinct in that we're looking at the same thing maybe from two different perspectives. Okay, so when we pick out the good, we're picking out something about that is slightly different than picking out as being. Best way to illustrate is to give a non-moral example of what I'm talking about, instead of trying to explain how these two things refer only to one. I apologize for that really poor explanation, but the non-moral example, let's put it this way. Let's use a geometric figure of a triangle. We can talk about the essence of a triangle to be a closed plane figure with three straight sides. Anything with that essence must have a number of properties, such as having angles that add up to 180 degrees interiorly, and so on. Right? So we know what a triangle is, essentially speaking. And there are objective facts that hold even when representative examples of a triangle fail to match the proper description. For every triangle you try to draw, you can imagine a kindergartner drawing a triangle, you can imagine yourself drawing a triangle, freehand, or even drawing it with a ruler, right? Every drawn triangle is flawed, but one drawn, of course, with the ruler or a straight edge is going to approximate the essence of a triangle more perfectly than the one drawn by the kindergartner, right? So one is a better triangle than the other. You can call one a good triangle and one a bad triangle, and the judgment would be entirely objective when we do that. It's not just a subjective opinion. And why is it objective? It's because there is an essence of what it means to be a triangle. All right? Now, it would be foolish to say that one has committed a fallacy in making a value judgment about the badness of a triangle on the basis of the facts about the essence of a triangle. So given its essence, the value judgment follows necessarily. All right? That's why you can't separate facts and values. Moral goodness, of course, is not the same thing as a good triangle, right? A moral goodness actually falls under the more general heading of goodness, the general notion of goodness. And living things provide better examples that are at least closer to a distinctively moral conception of goodness. So I'm going to give you this idea dealing with what we call Aristotelian categoricals. Living things can be described in terms of these types of categoricals. An Aristotelian categorical would be something like S's are P's, where S stands for subject, P stands for predicate. And this is not an existential proposition which says there's at least some S that is a P, or a universal proposition that says all S's are P's. Okay, it's to convey what is just a general norm. Okay, particular living things are instances of species, and species can only be described with these Aristotelian categoricals which provide general characteristics. So plugging in for S, the word cat, and plugging in for P, 4 legs, we can get the statement that cats have 4 legs, or cats are things with 4 legs, however you want to state that. Now, if a particular cat, of course, is missing a leg, it doesn't show that S's are not P's, okay? Because I'm not making the universal claim that all cats have 4 legs. I'm making the general norm claim that cats in general have 4 legs. So, if I find a cat that doesn't have 4 legs, it's not that that categorical is disproven, it's that that particular cat is seen as a defective instance of a cat, okay? So that's kind of what we're talking about. We've got these general characteristics, what it means to be a cat, and then we see certain things that don't approximate the essence correctly, if that's the way I want to phrase it. Okay, so in living things, the kind of norm in question is inextricably tied to the notion of teleology. So all who rightly define good put in its notion something about its status as an end, Aquinas says. There are certain ends that any organism must realize to flourish as the kind of organism that it is, and this entails a standard of goodness. Again, for an oak tree, if you've got deep roots, better than a weak root system, right? It's going to be more appropriate towards attaining its flourishing. A wolf that nurtures her young is to that extent a good wolf, and one that fails to nurture her young is considered defective in some way, right? So we can make these kinds of value judgments. Aquinas also says, all those things to which man has a natural inclination are naturally apprehended by reason as being good, and consequently as objects of pursuit, and their contraries as evil and objects of avoidance. Now, by inclination, Aquinas doesn't necessarily mean something consciously desired. It doesn't mean something that's, psychologically deep-seated or genetically determined. What he's speaking of, again, are final causes, natural teleology, various capacities. So the desires often match up with our natural purposes. Of course, not in every single case. We've got natural desires and we've got acquired desires, as we saw before, our needs and our wants. But natural has to do, again, with the final causes that are inherent in a thing. So it doesn't mean statistically common or in accord with the law of physics or having a genetic basis. That's not what we mean by natural. It has nothing to do with, again, like I said, a mechanistic view of nature. Final causes are possessed whether or not they're realized consciously. What is good for somebody may be something that we actually don't want. There are lots of things that are truly good for me that I might not want. You can even think of maybe a very base example of, a particular vegetable that might actually be very good in promoting human health, and I just don't like the taste of it, right? So that's not the best example, but it's an example of, again, rejecting something that's good. So the knowing, of course, the true good for oneself requires us to take a kind of a third-person perspective on things. All right. The 3 categories of goods are going to be divided according to really the types of souls that Aristotle provides. You've got the goods that are those in common with all living creatures that preserve our existence. You've got those goods that are in common with animals, sexual intercourse, child rearing, and then you've got those goods that are particular to rational animals, which has to do with, of course, our reason, knowing the truth, living in society, and things like that. And of course, they're hierarchically arranged, as we said before. The vegetative, the sensory, and the rational souls. Again, you have the faculties that go along with that. The higher goods presuppose the lower goods, because the pursuit of the truth, for instance, which is one of the higher goods, cannot be attained if you're not able to at least preserve your existence on the very base level, right? So the lower goods are subordinate to the higher in importance, but the lower goods are necessary to attain the higher. They exist for the sake of the higher. Now, in what does the good for man ultimately consist? We already said this was God. for Aquinas. So let's just look at the things that could potentially be good and why they're not our ultimate good. People can say wealth, right? Well, it can't be wealth because wealth is instrumental. Wealth is a means of attaining something else. Wealth isn't obviously good in its own right. It can't be honor because honor is something that's received as a consequence of realizing some other good. It can't be fame because fame can be achieved for doing things that are not good at all. There are people that are famous for doing very bad things. Power can't be our ultimate good because power, again, is a means, and it might also bring about an evil. Pleasure can't be our ultimate good because pleasure is also a consequence of realizing certain goods. There's a pleasure and satisfaction that we get from attaining certain things. It can't obviously be bodily pleasure because the body exists for the sake of the soul, and that there's a higher order there. And it can't be the good of the soul because the soul is created for the sake of something beyond itself. So it has to be something absolutely perfect, beyond which nothing more could be desired. And this is why Aquinas concludes that our ultimate good, our ultimate end, is God himself. It's necessarily good, and that follows from our nature. Okay, so again, the scholastic viewpoint is that the ultimate good ultimately comes back to God. Now, the natural law theory, as we said, is distinct from a divine command theory, particularly a voluntaristic divine command theory. Because remember, the big problem with the voluntaristic divine command theory is that what is good simply because God wills it. And since we've already introduced God in the last slide, this is a good place to bring back in the idea of God. William of Ockham, for instance, believed that the will is emphasized in God over his intellect. So it kind of provides the grounding for this idea of voluntaristic system, in which case absolutely anything could be good if only God willed it. Now, in divine natural law theory, rather, what is good for us is good because of our natures. It is not good for us because of some arbitrary command. God only ever wills us to do what's consistent with our nature. He's also the source of that nature. Right? And that nature is a reflection of the archetypes or the exemplar causes that God has in his mind to begin with. So again, this whole system goes back grounded in the divine essence. Now note, the intellect is metaphysically prior to the will, which it has to be. We talked about the relationship there. And the will derives from the intellect since it's a rational appetite. The divine intellect knows the natures of things, and the divine will then creates according to that knowledge. Okay? It's kind of in God how the intellect and will relate as well. Natural law theory ends up being rather robust moral theory as well. I just bring up this issue of conflict of duties, which is raised a lot in the course of dealing with ethics, that there are certain duties that seem to pull us in different directions or duties that seem to conflict with one another. And now natural law theory obviously is absolutistic. There are absolute rights and wrongs. There are moral obligations that are universal. And absolute rules can seem to rise or at least give rise to conflicting duties. Now Kant actually believes perfect duties never will actually truly conflict. But natural law theory actually recognizes the potential of conflicts and attempts to resolve them in a couple different ways, either through what's called a view known as graded absolutism or a theory called the double effect doctrine. So I think we've talked about graded absolutism before, and it basically is this, that there are absolute rules, absolute rights, absolute wrongs, absolute obligations that are binding, but they're graded within a hierarchy. So it recognizes that moral principles, like I said, are absolute and universal, but moral duties always make demands on us as agents. The duties, however, are graded hierarchically, and when two duties come into conflict, then our responsibility is always to pursue the greater duty over the lesser duty. And if both duties can't be fulfilled, the lesser has to give way to the greater. So that is one way to deal with this idea of conflicting duties. Another thing that's interesting is the double effect doctrine, which really does come to play in a lot of applied ethical debates that go on today. So, for instance, pertains to situations where an action has both good and bad effects. The doctrine states that a good action may be permissible even if it does have a bad effect. This is why it's not a purely consequentialist theory. Okay, but a bad action is not permissible even for the sake of achieving a good end. Again, why this is not a consequentialist theory. An action is permissible under 4 conditions. Okay, if the action is inherently either morally good or morally neutral. Without referring to consequences, there's an inherent goodness or neutrality or badness with all actions. Number 2, the bad effect that results from an action is not being used to produce a good effect. We don't seek a bad effect for the sake of a good effect as a side effect, though a bad effect can be a side effect of a good effect. Sounds really complicated, almost a tongue twister, but think of it this way. You think of the instance of killing a fetus in order to save a mother. The natural law perspective would be that you don't kill a fetus, which would be a bad effect, in order to produce the good effect of saving the mother's life. This would be relevant, obviously, to the abortion debate. But it doesn't mean steps shouldn't be taken to save the mother's life. That still might result in the death of the fetus, such as using certain drugs that happen to have that side effect, where the goal, of course, is not to kill the fetus, but to save the mother's life. And if the fetus happens to die in the process of taking these drugs, that might be a bad side effect, but it would not rule out taking those drugs to save the life. Number 3, the intention has to be to bring about a good effect. Right? We're not trying to bring about a bad effect for a good effect, but we're trying to bring about directly the good effect that may have some bad side effects. The good effect must at least be as important as the bad effect. Has to outweigh the bad effect in most situations, and if it doesn't, then the action is not permissible. Okay, so it's a rather well thought out theory, but it does require some reflection in particular instances to figure out what that best course of action is. The theory also understands the tripartite nature of moral action, that there is a nature of the act, whether it's good or bad, there's a motive that we need to consider, and then there's a situation in which we're acting. Those all come together to determine whether something is morally right or wrong. Natural law and virtue ethics, I think, both consider all 3 of these. Virtues never operate just purely mechanically. The completed act of virtue requires knowledge of right rules, motivation, again, to do what's noble, and then the right applications in the right situations, our deliberation in regards to our desires. And practical wisdom has to be employed. In the mean in every virtue is found through wisdom. We talked about the golden mean, and that's, again, relative to the individual and based on our reasoning. And there's no list of rules that's going to be sufficient. So wisdom can't be separated off from ethics. Now, there are objections to natural law. This is where we're going to end. I'm going to give you a few basic objections. Number 1, that there can't be a natural law because there's more than one theory about natural law. And we've only presented really the Aristotelian scholastic model, not Aristotelian, I should say, Thomistic scholastic natural law theory. But there are other natural law theories and ones that are actually divorced from the concept of religious ethics and God altogether. The response would be that, different theories do exist, but they also do agree on the basic content. And they're only going to disagree on secondary things, such as where these our knowledge comes from, for instance. This whole idea of, like I said, a general revelation might be something that some theories don't hold to. Second objection is it can't be a natural law because some people think there isn't. And if natural law is composed of objective principles that everybody knows, then shouldn't everybody know them? And the response would be everybody knows a lot of things that they don't realize that they know. The law of non-contradiction and logic, that you ought to pursue the good, that what the definition of truth is. There are a lot of things that you actually do know, even though you don't always know that you know them. Third objection, there can't be a moral law or natural law because no matter what moral principles we say it includes, someone can be found that's going to deny that principle. And again, if it's made of objective moral laws that everybody knows via synderesis, then how can anyone deny them? Well, the same way we cannot know things that we know, we can also repress things that we know and engage in the act of self-deception. So denied guilt can come in the form of a rationalization, right? We obviously can do this. Human beings are incredibly able to do some very bizarre things. And the fourth objection is there can't be a natural law because human beings always create new values. And that actually I'm going to deny. That the creation of new values is in fact impossible. What we call new is very often just a recombination of old values that societies have always held. And those can be traced back ultimately to natural law. Now, lengthy presentation, as most of these are, but I think we are good in that we have finally finished the normative ethical theories that in this course. So hopefully you got a lot out of this. I know this may have been one of the longer recordings and maybe more abstract and dealing with a lot of complex metaphysical questions. You might need to review it multiple times, but again, if you're taking the course, you've got a study guide. You don't have to know everything, but there are certain things I definitely want you to go back and kind of grasp. I want you to understand them as well as is possible. Thank you again for watching these videos. Like I said, this is the last in the series unless I modify the course in the future. But for now, thanks for watching. Good luck, and live a moral life. It's good. It's for your own happiness.